August 9th, 1965. A region gets a death sentence. Malaysia expels Singapore. On live TV, its leader breaks down crying. Most people believed it was finished. Fast forward 60 years. Singapore's GDP per capita exceeds $70,000. It's higher than the United States. The Lion City is cleaner than London and safer than New York. It's one of the most overpowered nations on earth with the world's #1 passport. That gives its citizens visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to 192 countries. That's roughly 88% of the world. So, how does a man who cried on camera turn a death sentence into one of the greatest comebacks in human history? To understand that, we have to rewind to the moment power changed hands. 1959. Singapore is still under British control, but the British Empire is weakening. Across Asia, colonies are demanding self-rule. In Singapore, a 35-year-old Cambridge-trained lawyer wins a historic election. His name is Kuan Yew. His party is the People's Action Party, the PAP. They don't promise comfort, they promise survival. At the time, Singapore was a crowded port city. Unemployment sat at 14%. Half the population was illiterate. Nearly 3/4 lived in slums without proper sanitation. Entire families shared outdoor toilets. Charcoal stoves filled narrow alleys with smoke. Ethnic tensions simmered between Chinese, Malays, and Indians. Political groups openly flirted with communism. Strikes were common. Riots often erupted. The British military provides thousands of jobs. Without it, the economy could collapse. This is what Lee inherits. Not a united people, not even a shared identity, just a fragile trading island. Singapore had no natural resources, no minerals, no oil, no farmland to fall back on. If it was going to survive, it must manufacture value from its people. But Lee believed it could not survive alone, and that belief would cost a fortune. Lee saw merging as the solution. So, in 1963, Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia. The union promised a larger domestic market, shared defense, political stability, and economic integration. For a brief moment, it looked like survival had been secured, but the foundations were already cracked. Singapore's leadership believed in meritocracy. Malaysia's federal leadership prioritized ethnic Malay dominance. The ruling coalition in Kuala Lumpur defended special privileges. Lee openly challenged that framework. He called for a Malaysian Malaysia built on equal citizenship and equal opportunity, with no race placed above another. The idea was explosive. When the PAP began contesting elections outside Singapore, Kuala Lumpur saw expansion, not cooperation. Tensions escalated quickly. In 1964, race riots erupted in Singapore. Violence spread through the streets. People were killed. Communities fractured. Trust collapsed. Economic disputes followed. Singapore was required to send a significant share of its revenue to the federal government, yet promised integration stalled. Tariffs remained. Trade barriers stayed. The partnership became political warfare. On August 9th, 1965, Malaysia expelled Singapore from the Federation, against its will. Overnight, the port city stood alone, staring at extinction. Independence did not bring safety, it removed protection. Singapore now stood alone in one of the most volatile regions in the world. To the north was Malaysia, the country that had just expelled it. To the south was Indonesia, under President Sukarno, who had launched military confrontations across the region. Just months earlier, Indonesian commandos had bombed a building in downtown Singapore. Civilians were killed. Singapore had no army. The British were preparing to withdraw their forces, and their bases supported thousands of local jobs. When they left, unemployment would surge. Half of Singapore's water came from Malaysia under a long-term agreement. Most of its food arrived through the same border. If Malaysia tightened supply, Singapore would suffocate. There were no oil wells, no farmland, no mineral reserves. It was a small trading port with no safety net. Lee moved quickly. Singapore applied to join the United Nations and pushed for diplomatic recognition. Legitimacy meant protection. In 1967, Singapore became a founding member of ASEAN. Everyone got the message. Stop fighting, start cooperating. Countries that had recently been tense with each other chose coordination over confrontation. Isolation was a liability. Regional alignment was insurance. At home, he introduced mandatory national service. Every young man would serve. The army would be built from scratch. Quietly, Singapore sought help from Israel. Military doctrine centered on deterrence. If Singapore could not defend itself, no one would. But survival was not only military, it was economic. And both had to be secured immediately. Security bought time. but time alone doesn't create prosperity. After independence in 1965, Lee leaned heavily on Dutch economist Albert Winsemius, whom he had first invited to Singapore in 1960. Winsemius stayed on as chief economic advisor. His suggestions were blunt. Forget ideology, forget nationalism. Make Singapore irresistible to global capital. If the island had no natural resources, it would build a manufacturing and service platform. If it lacked a domestic market, it would serve the world. Through the late 1960s, Lee kept corporate taxes competitive, simplified regulations, and streamlined permits. He actively courted foreign investment. American firms arrived. Japanese manufacturers followed. Electronics, shipbuilding, and petrochemicals formed the early pillars. After Britain announced its military withdrawal in 1968, Lee converted former naval bases into commercial shipyards. He modernized and expanded the port. Lee also enforced political stability. He restricted strikes. In 1969, he consolidated labor unions under the National Trades Union Congress with close government alignment. He made policy consistency a deliberate strategy and treated corruption as an existential threat. So he strengthened the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau and gave it the power to investigate anyone. In 1975, authorities prosecuted and convicted Minister Wee Toon Boon. No one stood above the law, but factories and discipline were not enough. Lee wanted citizens to own the country's future, and we want you to help us grow. If you're finding this breakdown useful, take a second to like and subscribe. In the early 1960s, most Singaporeans didn't own homes. Many lived in overcrowded kampongs and inner-city slums with wooden huts and open drains. Fires broke out frequently. Disease spreads easily. Lee understood that stability required ownership long ago, so he created the Housing and Development Board in 1960. After independence, he accelerated the building program in 1965. It cleared slums at scale and replaced them with high-rise concrete apartment blocks equipped with running water, electricity, and modern sanitation. These were not free handouts. The government sold them on 99-year leases, heavily subsidized but structured for purchase. The goal was ownership, not dependency. In 1989, authorities formalized the ethnic integration policy. It required each housing block to reflect the country's racial composition. Chinese, Malays, and Indians would live side by side. Segregation would not return. At the same time, the Central Provident Fund, established in 1955, expanded significantly after 1968. Workers contributed mandatory savings, which they could use to purchase HDB flats. The pooled capital funded national development. By the 1980s, home ownership exceeded 80%. Today, roughly 88% of residents live in homes they own. In 1984, Singapore launched MediSave. Citizens had to use their own CPF savings to pay for medical bills. In 1990, MediShield was added to cover major hospital costs. Healthcare followed the same rule as housing: save first, spend later. No broad welfare state. No open-ended subsidies. Personal responsibility stayed high. Government liabilities stayed low. Stability deepened. Lee prioritized one investment above all: human capital. Because if you have no oil, you must refine people. Housing created stability. Stability attracted investment. But that investment created a new problem. Singapore didn't yet have enough skilled workers. Factories were rising through the late 1960s. Multinational firms were expanding operations, but low-cost labor would never be enough. If wages rose without skills rising with them, competitiveness would collapse. So Lee redesigned the pipeline. In 1966, the government formalized bilingual education. English became the working language, connecting Singapore to global trade and finance. At the same time, students continued learning their mother tongues: Chinese, Malay, or Tamil. Identity remained intact. Commerce expanded. Education shifted toward mathematics and science. Technical institutes grew through the 1970s to support industrialization. Universities aligned programs with industry demand. Curricula were not abstract. They were economic tools. As manufacturing matured, Singapore climbed the value chain. What began as basic assembly in the late 1960s moved into semiconductors in the 1970s, then pharmaceuticals and precision engineering in the 1980s. The workforce evolved with it. Singapore was no longer selling cheap labor, it was selling trained minds. Today, Singapore ranks near the top globally in mathematics and science performance. Literacy is near universal. Human capital became the country's primary resource. And once talent deepened, something else began to concentrate: capital. And geography amplified the effect. Singapore sits on the Strait of Malacca, one of the most critical shipping lanes on Earth. A massive share of global trade passes through it, including roughly a third of the world's seaborne oil. In the late 1960s and 1970s, as oil traffic through Asia surged, Singapore moved aggressively into refining and marine fuel supply. By the 1980s, the island had become one of the world's largest oil refining and bunkering hubs. Skilled workers ran global operations, regulatory stability attracted long-term investment, money began to accumulate. In 1968, Singapore allowed banks to conduct offshore US dollar transactions separate from domestic banking rules. This became known as the Asian dollar market. It allowed global banks to park and move US dollars in Singapore without the constraints applied in their home countries. The timing was precise. Western capital needed an Asian base. Singapore offered neutrality, legal certainty, and strict regulation. In 1971, the government created the Monetary Authority of Singapore to centralize financial supervision and protect stability. Discipline became institutional. Through the 1970s, international banks expanded rapidly in the city. Capital could move between New York, London, and Singapore across time zones, creating continuous liquidity. The state reinforced long-term capital management. Temasek was established in 1974 to hold strategic state investments. In 1981, the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation, now GIC, began managing foreign reserves globally. CPF savings added depth to domestic capital pools. Over the decades, these institutions accumulated vast reserves. Today, Singapore's sovereign investment arms manage assets approaching $2 trillion. Capital moved in, power concentrated, and concentrated wealth requires credible protection. In 1965, Singapore had no army. By 1967, the National Service Act made conscription permanent. The Singapore Armed Forces, formed after independence, expanded rapidly. Israeli advisors helped design early doctrine and training structures. But this was not symbolic force building. It was a deterrence architecture. Defense spending remained consistently high for a small nation, averaging between 3 and 5% of GDP. The Air Force modernized. The Navy secured vital sea lanes. Mandatory service created a large reserve system, ensuring depth beyond the active force. In 1984, Singapore formalized the concept of total defense, military, civil, economic, social, and psychological. Security was no longer just about soldiers. It was about resilience across society. The objective was to make aggression irrational. Remember the man crying in 1965? By the 1990s, 3 decades later, he commanded one of Southeast Asia's most technologically advanced armed forces. But strength also meant control. The People's Action Party remained dominant after 1959. Electoral rules evolved to favor stability. Public protests required permits. Major media institutions operated with a tightly regulated framework. The Internal Security Act, first enacted in 1960 and retained after independence, allowed detention without trial in cases deemed threats to national security. Lee argued that communism and communal violence posed existential risks in the 1960s. Critics called the system restrictive. Supporters called it pragmatic. Lee strongly believed that instability would destroy investor confidence and fracture society. So he turned policy continuity into a competitive advantage. Unlike many developing countries, Singapore avoided chronic deficits. Budgets were tightly controlled, surpluses were accumulated, not spent. Reserves were treated as strategic assets, not political tools. Spending discipline became structural. Singapore has maintained an AAA sovereign credit rating for decades. Corruption remains among the lowest globally. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau answers directly to the Prime Minister's office. Capital values predictability. Singapore institutionalized it. And once predictability was locked in, the compounding began. The system built in the 1960s was designed for crises. The first major test came in 2001. The global technology bubble burst with the dot-com collapse. Singapore slipped into recession. Exports weakened. Investment slowed. For a trade-dependent economy, it was a big deal. 2 years later, in 2003, SARS struck. Visitor arrivals collapsed within weeks. Hotels emptied. Flights were cut. The economy contracted again. Then, in 2008 and 2009, global trade fell at the fastest pace in decades during the financial crisis. Singapore's GDP declined in 2009 as external demand evaporated. This is where the earlier decades mattered. In 2009, the government introduced the Resilience Package and, for the first time in many years, drew on past reserves with presidential approval. Banks remained well capitalized. The exchange rate framework was maintained. There was no IMF rescue, no sovereign default. The buffers held. Then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic shut borders, halted aviation, and disrupted supply chains. In response, Singapore rolled out multiple fiscal packages in 2020, drawing tens of billions from accumulated reserves. The same reserves built through housing savings, fiscal surpluses, and disciplined governance were used exactly as designed. The crises changed. The framework didn't. Singapore never had access to natural resources, a large domestic market, or strategic depth. It built a system instead. Was that visionary leadership, or stability engineered at a democratic cost? Comment your thoughts. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. History does not just repeat, it rhymes. So make sure you are listening for the next Money Echoes. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.